Well, hello. Thank you for joining me and thank you for joining us for the launch of net assessment and military strategy. My name is Tom Mahnken. I'm a senior research professor of strategic studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And I think you're in for a real treat over the next hour as we talk about this new book. Now, this is a book that was a long time in coming. For many years as the book was in its gestation, I thought maybe it was too long in coming. At times I wasn't sure whether it was gonna happen, but fortunately it all came together to produce this edited volume. The process of producing this book spanned 2 workshops over the course of several years, and workshops that included 2 of our panelists today. It included a set of essays and was really capped off by an introductory essay by Andrew W. Marshall, the first director of net assessment in the Pentagon and longtime director of net assessment. Let me first say what this book is not. This book is not a festschrift. It wasn't really meant to be a festschrift, nor is it meant to be just some sort of form of hagiography or some commendatory volume. Rather, this book is really meant for practitioners or potential practitioners of net assessment or various types of strategic assessments. It was meant to be a gift to the rising generation of strategic analysts, students of strategic studies, to give them some insight into the theory and the practice of net assessment over time, to include the practice of net assessment in the U.S. government, but also beyond that. And as you'll see, we've got a real stellar group of authors in the book who can speak to the topic with academic rigor, but also with a practitioner's experience and a practitioner's eye. There are a lot of people I'd like to thank for this book. Certainly, all of those who participated in the workshops that led to the book. Certainly the authors of the chapters. I'd also like to thank Bob Solano for his help in editing the manuscript and editing all the various parts of this book. I'd also like to thank Jeffrey Byrne from Cambria Press, who's just a superb editor and it's been a joy to work with across a number of projects across a number of years. And then lastly, I'd like to thank the late Andrew Marshall. For a very deep intellectual debt that I owe to him. My association with him really has changed the way I see the world, the questions that I ask, how I go about answering them, and then also just thank him for contributing an introductory essay to this volume. I think it was the last thing that he wrote before he passed last year. Look, we're fortunate to have a distinguished group of panelists to talk further and explore further this book and the subject of net assessment. So we have with us Dean Cohen, we have Dr. Jackie Deal, and we have Professor Thomas Ridd. And I'm going to turn to each of them in turn for a set of thoughts, reflections, comments. And then I'd like to open up the discussion to those of you who are participating. And to facilitate that, we have the Q&A function. And so it's not too soon to start submitting questions into Q&A. And once we get done with the panelists' thoughts and reflections, then we'll turn to Q&A, and I'll curate that whole process. So to get us started, I'd like to turn first to Dean Eliot Cohen. Dean Cohen was appointed Dean of SAIS in 2019 and has been part of the SAIS faculty since 1990. He previously directed the Strategic Studies program, founded and directed the Philip Merrill Center, and served as the Executive Vice Dean of SAIS. Also of import to to this gathering. Early on in his career, he served in the Office of Net Assessment fairly briefly, and then really over a good span of his career has thought about, written about the topic of net assessment. So Dean Cohen, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you for putting together this terrific book. And thanks to all the contributors and all of you are here for this discussion. So I thought I would just say a few words about net assessment during the Cold War, since I think I'm really I'm certainly the oldest one here, and I remember net assessment from that period particularly well. I actually went to net assessment as a reservist in the early 1980s, and I got to see a fair number of the assessments that were done there. Let me just say a few things, maybe by way of setting up the larger discussion. I think on the one hand, we would all agree that net assessment is a reflection of an extraordinary personality, Andrew Marshall, the way he thought about the world, the way he brought along several generations of strategic thinkers. And so it's, Emerson, I think, once said that any institution is but the lengthened shadow of one man. And that's certainly the case here. On the other hand, and I think the book makes this very clear, it has evolved into something that outlasted Andy, and that's very much what he wanted. And so it's something that we can think about as an academic discipline or set of disciplines apart to some extent from the founder. Second thing is, I think the thing about net assessment, about both the office itself and then the mode of thinking that it represented, is it was molded by the Cold War in a number of key respects. First, a very long-term competition, which throughout most of that period, none of us really foresaw it coming to an end. I think our former colleague, Fred Starr, was the only one who did, and that's because of a book he wrote about jazz in the Soviet Union, but that's a separate subject, although it's the kind of thing that Andy would have loved. But in any case, it was a long-term competition, which did not, thank God, break out in war, where there was, on the one hand, obviously a lot of the information was obscure. And so, there were very sensitive elements to the way net assessments were done. I think one of the net assessments, the submarine anti-submarine balance, there were only I think 3 people who read it or who could read it. But on the other hand, there was also lots of raw material, and the office, I think, pioneered ways of using unclassified material, such as, for example, publications in the Military Historical Journal of the General Staff, to figure out how the other side was thinking. So it was really a kind of an ideal blend of the secret and the not so secret. And of course, as I said, no real test of combat. And I think what happened, which the net assessment endeavor captured, was that as you have a prolonged period of competition, you need to think in the long term rather than in the more static kinds of ways that military analysts in the past have thought about it. Net assessment is as old as the Peloponnesian War. The Spartan king Archidamus says to his people, "Tell me, what is to be our war? We're very different than the Athenians." But I think what is different about net assessment as described in this book is that it's analyses that take place over a very long time and that are methodologically eclectic. And that's really, for me, one of the most striking things about net assessment. There are some parts which are definitely partake of formal social science. There are parts that, things that take, derive from simulations and war games, but, from biology, from anthropology, from history, as one of the chapters by our friend Wick Murray describes it. So that's really the analytic legacy of net assessment. The question, I think, and I'm sure it's one that we'll turn to later on today, is, well, how applicable is net assessment today? Was it a mode of viewing the world that was primarily of value during the Cold War, or is it one that can be applied today? To be sure, that assessment talked about the Soviet concept of a military technical revolution of military affairs, but that was a more technologically driven set of discussions. I think one answer to that is actually, unfortunately, because of the arrival of Sino-American strategic rivalry at a pretty deep level, net assessment lives. I mean, we're, I think, in the middle of another long-term strategic competition. So many of the intellectual tools, and more importantly, the frame of mind of net assessment will continue to be valuable. But I would add to that is that legacy of eclecticism, of drawing on many, many different forms of human knowledge to ask the big strategic questions. That's a particularly profound legacy, and one that's very much worth sustaining.
Thank you, Dean Cohen. I would now like to turn to Dr. Jacqueline Newmyer Deal to provide her thoughts. Dr. Deal is president and CEO of the Long-Term Strategy Group, a DC-based defense consultancy, and senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And for the last 14 years, she's worked with the Office of Net Assessment on projects related to East Asia, including most recently an analysis of the security implications of alternative Chinese futures, an assessment of China's capacity for technological innovation, and a book chapter on China's energy security strategy. So Dr. Deal, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tom. Congratulations to you on the book, which is path-breaking and which I know required the rewarding but often difficult labor of coordinating among great minds. And it's a privilege to take part in this panel, an honor to follow Eliot and to precede Professor Ridd, because I've admired their work for a long time. Tom asked me to speak about interesting questions for the set of research and analytical methods that we call net assessment going forward. I'll be taking up Professor Cohen's question of how applicable these methods or techniques are today. I'll also talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the approach. And I draw inspiration from Mr. Marshall's chapter in the book. Normally, when people post-retirement look back and write about their careers, you expect an apologia or an effort to settle old scores. In this case, you'd be mistaken. Mr. Marshall had more than 60 years of material, professional experiences dating back to the late 1940s to draw on, and I think he chose his themes very carefully, with an eye not toward the past, but actually toward the future. One way of summarizing his introduction is that it answers 4 questions. First, what is net assessment and how does it compare to other kinds of assessment? Second, what kind of information do you need to collect to do a net assessment? Third, what is the importance of asymmetries between you and your opponent that you may discover through your research? Fourth, how does economics fit into net assessment? All of these can be applied to the current competition between the United States and the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, as Professor Cohen averred, in ways that illuminate interesting new questions. So I'll just discuss them briefly, and then I'd be happy to return to any or all of them in the Q&A. First, net assessment versus other assessments. Mr. Marshall wanted to clarify at the outset that net assessment is only one kind of assessment suited to a particular kind of customer and a particular kind of question. Other assessments that are perhaps more common and familiar might focus on the expected outcome of tactical interactions. For instance, who would win a battle based on detailed models of each side, order of battle, weapon systems, and their physical characteristics. The net assessments have been done for the Secretary of Defense in his or her capacity as the person making investment decisions that would bear fruit in increments often extending at least 5 to 10 years out, for the acquisition of platforms that would in some cases be expected to last decades. So the Secretary needs to understand likely opponents' capabilities not just today, but in the future. Net assessment requires trend analysis to do force projections, which has implications for the second question about what kind of information you need to collect to do these kinds of assessments. Basically, you need details on patterns in your own and the opponent's allocation of resources, and you look back to look forward. If you collect enough data detailing trends in the other side's investments, you should be positioned to answer questions like, of all the things on which the opponent could spend, does he exhibit any kind of stable preferences? Can you detect any historically or organizationally based biases in favor of certain capabilities or areas of investment as opposed to others? This is an exciting time for the collection of data, given the proliferation of sensors and open source information. It may also increasingly be a tricky time, even apart from the issue of distortions or fakes. The sheer volume of information to collect and sift through can be daunting, and the amount of noise in the environment reflecting motivated or unmotivated biases is also an issue. That said, we could ask, what are the trends in the People's Republic of China's military buildup? Beyond citing official numbers from Beijing to say that the People's Liberation Army's budget has grown rapidly in the period of the PRC's economic rise, we want to be able to say things that are more specific about the relevant share of different PLA service branches and arms, forces for fighting on land versus at sea, supporting capabilities in the information domain and in space. We can only do that with relatively detailed specific data. During the Cold War, by the mid to late 1950s, this kind of effort revealed that Soviet spending favored air defenses, that the Soviet long-range aviation capacity was relatively underdeveloped, that there were very significant differences in nuclear command, control, and custody arrangements between the Soviets and the United States. With these proclivities identified, the Secretary of Defense could invest in ways that took them into account and that shifted the competition into areas that favored the United States. This gets to the third question about asymmetries, because another way of describing these insights is that they're all asymmetries or indicative of them. That is, important differences between our approach and that of the Soviets in particular areas of endeavor. An assumption behind the net assessment approach is that the United States is engaged in a long-term competition which could escalate from peace to crisis or war, but that may unfold largely in peacetime. The goal, therefore, is to shape the competition into areas that favor you, and that may over time convince the adversary that his strategy is failing. The Secretary's investment decisions are a tool to shape the competition into areas that favor the United States. Do the Cold War asymmetries highlighted by Mr. Marshall apply to the US PRC competition? Compared to our forces, are the Chinese relatively more focused on air defenses and relatively underdeveloped in the area of long-range bombers? Is the PLA's way of handling nuclear command and control, or command and control in general, different from our approach? In the Cold War case, while these asymmetries were very important, perhaps the key asymmetry was the one in the economic sphere, which brings us to the fourth question about economics. Despite what many academic and professional economists believed, the Soviets were devoting a huge share of their GDP to the defense sector. Their command system led to much lower overall growth than perhaps might otherwise have been achieved, and certainly much lower growth than most Westerners believed, and allied to this was their lack of competitiveness in certain important technology areas. By the end of the Cold War, this turned out to be in some sense what the competition was about, or the key asymmetry that we could exploit to convince Soviet leaders that their economic model was not succeeding but failing. Is any of this true of the CCP today? On the surface, no. Spending on the PLA does not appear to be cannibalizing the rest of the Chinese economy. But the Chinese Communist Party does run a command or semi-command economy. So what kinds of outlays are being prioritized? In what area or areas does the CCP expend outsized effort, measured in capital or leadership attention or skilled labor, which are also scarce resources? Internal security? That's what they say. And the PRC's ever-growing surveillance state, coupled with the concentration camps in Western China, give us reason to investigate this possibility. What about political influence? In the history of the Chinese Communist Party, every effort to use military force has been correlated with influence operations that, depending on your metric, may even have eclipsed the effort expended on purely military endeavors. Or at least Chinese assessments may skew toward political influence as opposed to other more standard measures of power. What about technology? Along with influence in foreign capitals, the CCP has clearly been focused on acquiring technology from abroad by a variety of means, legal and illegal, sometimes through importing people. This brings us to the issue of talent or human capital. In what areas has the PRC's search for talent been focused? Information technology, yes. This involves computer scientists, but also physicists and engineers. Also, biology and the biosciences appear to be a major focus. We can ask, how do the PRC's priorities compare with ours? Our system is less oriented around huge national plans and more subject to serendipity, but we can nonetheless tell where the growth in PhDs and labs opened and grants awarded and patent filings is. And finally, what about the cost of empire? This was an area for Cold War assessment, and given the amount of PRC propaganda around the Belt and Road Initiative, and potentially also investment, the area bears scrutiny. It broaches the issue of allies on both sides, though in the PRC's case, dependencies or tributaries might be a better term. The PRC's approach looks like it involves relatively high startup costs in the form of capital transfers and possibly imports, but they seem to hope that they can leverage they can then leverage the relationships with other countries for various kinds of gains. By contrast, the United States generally has a light touch, laissez-faire approach, but historically has incurred extended deterrence costs associated with its alliance network, which also implicates strategic nuclear issues. This is a complicated set of questions because our approach may be changing as the US share of global GDP declines, and at the same time, the PRC's outlays are probably not as great as advertised. Stepping back, the search for asymmetries seems important because I'm not sure we've yet identified the equivalent of the Soviets' economic handicap for the PRC. When we look back at the unfolding US PRC competition, what aspect of their model will we identify as the weak link? Just to conclude by returning to the definition of net assessment and the approach's strengths and weaknesses, as Mr. Marshall noted, net assessment is a particular kind of assessment for a particular kind of customer with a particular kind of question. It's not applicable to every question, and it supports decision makers facing longer-term choices. That is, in some sense, a limit. If you don't believe we are in a long-term competition, you may not be interested in using detailed projections about the competitor as an input to your decision-making. Conducting net assessments is difficult. The work of acquiring the data required for those projections and comparisons can be tedious, as I know Professors Mahnken and Cohen know. It's not for everyone. Also, there is no cookbook for how to execute net assessments because it's not clear in advance which areas of the adversary's behavior should draw your attention and effort. It's an iterative process which requires time and some degree of patience and persistence. Not all enterprises can afford either of those. But I think the reason the book will attract many readers is that for all the dismissal of the PRC in the past, there is growing recognition of the existence of a competition today, and responsible decision makers want assistance for their efforts to position the United States to win. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Deal. Let me now turn to our third panelist, Professor Thomas Rid, for his thoughts. Thomas Rid is Professor of Strategic Studies at SAIS, and he's written on disinformation and cyber warfare, most recently in his new book, Active Measures, which is highly recommended. So, Professor Rid, over to you.
Thank you. For some reason, my camera has decided to interrupt the signal here because it was switched off for such a long time. Should I just continue without picture? Is that okay?
We'll imagine your face.
I apologize for this, but that's an unexpected glitch because it was mute for such a long time. So one thing that I miss most about these COVID, writing and teaching in COVID times is having inspiring lunches with my colleagues. And the most inspiring lunches I usually had with Tom Mahnken, because he is, I think, the most well-read, or certainly one of the most well-read colleagues that I can think of. And every time I finish one of those lunches, I walk away thinking, oh my God, I'm not reading enough. So when he invited me to present very briefly here in the context of this book launch, of course I had to say yes. And as I was reading to prepare for this event, 3 questions leapt out at me. The first is, what's unique about net assessment in terms of methodology? Really, what is net assessment? And of course, that is a question that is tackled by multiple authors. And it seems to me, Eliot Cohen mentioned the eclectic methodology here. It seems to me that the eclectic methodology is one of the core features of net assessment. And in some ways reflects Tom's ferocious reading appetite, because you really have to turn to, Andy Marshall mentions Simon and March, the giants in organizational study, for example, that he was inspired by. It's really that kind of open mind that it appears to me informs the discipline of net assessment. An open mind that doesn't recoil from going to a completely different discipline and reading about something that you haven't encountered before. And while that sounds easy and obvious, it really is not in practice. We rarely venture into very different literatures. So that's one aspect. The other question that leapt out at me is, what really is the relationship between net assessment and intelligence assessments? And of course, that is a quite complicated question that shines through in many of the chapters as well, not least because classified intelligence, classified information goes into net assessments, and many, if not most, of the ONA's products are still classified. So in some ways, we in the public, open researchers are quite limited in their own, sorry to go meta for a moment, in their assessment of net assessments. It seems to me that the ONA, the methodology of net assessments comes in between straight up classified intelligence analysis and assessments and what's today called open source analysis. And of course, one of the tendencies of open source intelligence analysis, one of the temptations that is built into looking at, metadata of pictures, of certain files that are leaked and whatnot, a tendency there is to be sucked into deeply technical, deeply tactical considerations. And of course, net assessment is almost designed to withstand this temptation to get sucked into small aspects. Of course, small aspects really matter. I was struck by that one finding from 1947 that Andy Marshall mentions, that 3/4 of the Soviet Union's stainless steel production went into nuclear facilities. Clearly a very important small detail, but always put into the wider, bigger context. And finally, just briefly, the other question that leapt out at me was, what about the future of net assessment? As a discipline and as a field that was so heavily influenced by the Cold War, how does net assessment deal with non-state actors? How does net assessment deal with technologies that emerged only after the end of the Cold War and in their full force? And it seems that there, I think most of the open questions, I still have a lot of open questions and I haven't finished reading the whole book yet, but it seems to me that that's a theme for a potentially interesting discussion, how net assessment could be deployed and used to pull together other new forms of analysis. For example, in my field, threat intelligence, which is the sort of technical intelligence discipline in the private sector on adversaries. It seems to me that there are open natural connections to net assessment that haven't been explored yet. And I think this book will make it easier for us to begin that conversation and to pull together bird's eye strategic assessment with deeply technical findings. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Ridd. And look, I think we've had 3 complementary perspectives on the subject of net assessment and on the content of this book. So I'm grateful to Dean Cohen, Dr. Deal, and Professor Ridd for their comments. I also want to acknowledge, we have a very distinguished group of participants with us today. I want to acknowledge Abe Shulsky, who's online, one of the authors in the book. I just wanted to call Abe out publicly because I see him as a participant. But overall, a very distinguished group of participants. And so I'd like to actually turn the conversation kind of over to them and to open up the conversation. We already have a set of questions. And if you have additional questions, please use the Q&A function. But I'm going to abuse the chair's prerogative before we get to the questions, and surface a couple of criticisms of net assessment, and try to get the panelists' reaction. The first came from a late retired Army flag officer, and I won't mention the individual's name, but a very bright officer with a military background, an academic background, and I remember one time sitting next to this individual as part of a discussion about kind of net assessment, and he just kind of leaned to me and he said, "Oh, well, there's nothing special about that. It's all just good strategy." meaning strategy should be about strengths and weaknesses. It should be about interaction. And so there's well, there's nothing special about net assessment critique. The other critique was more personal and more recent. Year ago, 2 years ago, I was asked to be the dinner speaker at a small seminar in Silicon Valley with some folks from defense and some folks from from the high tech industry, and I was supposed to speak about net assessment. And I gave what I thought was a very convincing talk about the value of net assessment and the net assessment approach, capturing many of the elements that I heard the panelists enunciate. And afterwards, the host, who was a sort of a household, again, I won't mention the name, but sort of a household name in the high tech industry, said, "Well, you sound kind of convincing, but we all know the Defense Department's all screwed up, and the acquisition system's all screwed up, and we can't produce things quickly, and we can't produce things well. So this whatever this this net assessment you're talking about, I'm just not convinced, because how could we have that and then be so screwed up?" So I'd give it first to Dean Cohen and Dr. Deal and Professor Ritt, if you want to chime in as well. How would you respond to those those criticisms?
So to the first one, I would say the kind of strategy the general does, to the extent that a general does strategy, and I've known some generals who do, and I've known many who don't, is something very different. They tend to be very focused on an immediate problem and use of armed forces in conflict. I think the thing that was so distinctive about net assessment is its look at the long term, and at a much more subtle, multifaceted kind of competition. Whereas strategy has to be about, okay, what's the objective? How do we bring the resources to bear on it? And how do we execute it? So I think the two are complementary, but it seems to me they're quite different. Secondly, we tend to be quite critical of ourselves, but actually you can argue that when you look at a lot of the technology that historically the Defense Department has acquired, a lot of it's been pretty good. And some of it, one can even argue, and Tom, you should speak to this, that there were acquisition decisions that were made very deliberately and that were timed very deliberately in a way to kind of complicate Soviet defense expenditures and drive them to spend a lot of money on a lot of things in ways that were beneficial to us. So we tend to be our most severe critics. That's good. That's what it is to be a liberal democracy. But I think that shouldn't blind us. One might also point out that Silicon Valley has had more than its share of screw ups as well. I mean, so talk to me about WeWork. The question that I think is a better question is, can you have net assessment without an office of net assessment? Because the reason why this approach worked was not just, part of it was the unusual personality of Andrew Marshall, but also was the fact that you had an office with, by academic standards, a lot of money to throw around, $10-20 million a year. You can buy a lot of analysis for that, and you can hire people. Whereas it's hard for me to see independent institutions, and for sure not independent scholars, being able to do the same thing. So in other words, what you might have here is an intellectual approach, which at some level depends on having a particular kind of organization willing to fund particular kinds of work.
I'll just chime in and second Professor Cohen's response. Like a lot of brilliant ideas, net assessment has the quality that once it's articulated, it seems kind of commonsensical, but it's less often executed well than you would think, given how kind of intuitive it is and how obvious the need is. And as Professor Cohen said, it has a lot in common actually with a commander's appreciation of the battlefield, the kinds of assessments that are done for nearer term operational or tactical purposes. And I think Mr. Marshall actually said he thought each service should have its own net assessment function. His net assessment by design was to serve the senior leadership in the department with these longer term questions. And that did require a certain breakthrough in thinking that wasn't widely known, which was that this intuition that the competition with the Soviet Union might not end in a war. It might go on for decades and be mostly waged in peacetime, which meant that it would be reasonable and competitively useful to bring to bear techniques from the management field, from the business field, that have to do with trying to shape the competition away from your competitor's strengths and towards your strengths, or to exploit the competitor's weaknesses to get the competitor to play your game rather than having the competitor make you play his game. And while that sounds like common sense too, it wasn't a widely shared intuition or assumption, I think, at the time that Mr. Marshall developed it, that the interaction with the Soviets may be largely a peacetime affair. And it may also apply to the competition with the Chinese. For the second question, basically, if DoD is so screwed up, how good could net assessment be? How could it be effective? And there's a question I see in the Q&A along the same lines about even broader, if the US is so screwed up with its election cycles and their vagaries and our American ADHD, is the question from David, what good can net assessment do? I think, again, it's important to recognize that net assessment isn't there to fix all problems or answer all questions, and it can be very useful even if the insights that it delivers from its diagnostic net assessment, if those insights are used by decision makers in particular functional or service-specific or even branch-specific domains, in particular areas of activity, they can have large payoffs. You don't necessarily have to ensure that every decision made by the entire Department of Defense is honed for is optimal for our whole strategy. You can do some good if you give the decision makers insights that help them in discrete areas, or if you give senior leaders in particular services insights that can help them make their case. So I think we have to kind of scope or bound what we're asking net assessment to do. And I think the history of the Cold War suggests that we can be pretty effective even with the vagaries of our system, our political system, different parties coming in and out of office, the way that we do have a tendency to focus on the wars or conflicts that we're in, we can still be strategic over the longer term.
Thank you. Professor Reid, did you want to chime in on this, or do you want to pass?
I mean, just briefly, it seems to me if I had to respond to why is net assessment not the same thing as strategy, it appears to me that there's a misunderstanding in objective. Strategy guides decisions, and net assessment informs decisions, and has to do so through an integrated presentation of detail with high-level principles. And I mean, that's my impression from what I've read. I'm obviously not in the best position to answer here, but that presentation and convincing analysis based in detail is what shines through in Andy Marshall's chapter, for example. That's a very different goal in my perspective.
Thank you. First question I want to take is from my former Naval War College colleague, Mike O'Hara. And to the students in my net assessment class who are in attendance, I didn't plant this question. The question is, what has been the role of wargaming in net assessment? Have these methods of inquiry been analytically separate and distinct, or have they been complementary and occasionally nested with each other? I say it's not planted because we just devoted this part of this morning's net assessment class to this topic. So just to show my students that I wasn't wasting your time earlier today. So I guess I would get the ball rolling just by saying that I think as the panelists have explained that net assessment is a kind of a multidisciplinary approach. So I think, wargaming is a tool. I think it's an important tool, but one of many, in the toolkit. And I think for gaining insight into competitor behavior and gaining insight into the character of modern wargaming can be very helpful. But I think those of us who look, or those who would look to wargaming for answers as opposed to insight, may be looking in the wrong place. But I'm going to pick on Dr. Deal, just knowing that I know you and your colleagues have been giving a lot of thought to wargaming today, and maybe some words there if you're comfortable talking about that, and then open it up to anybody else who wants to chime in.
Sure. Well, I feel funny talking to somebody from the Naval War College about wargaming. I have all the respect in the world for the wargaming at the Naval War College, but for other participants, I think there are many different kinds of war games. Some games are designed for training purposes. Others are designed to potentially justify certain budget allocations, but there's a specific kind of game that's done for net assessment purposes that, again, is more diagnostic, tends to be, or has to be, iterative, and they're a tool to help you kind of home in on what the balance is about in a certain geographic or functional area of the competition. That's one way to use games for net assessment. There are ways of exploring potential plausible future interactions that bring to the surface, ideally, plausible potential red or green third-party moves or responses to blue moves, to United States actions that you might not otherwise have thought of, but that can inform how you proceed with your assessment as you're looking for what is this competition in this particular area geographically or functionally about. Therefore, what do I need to count or measure? What attributes on my side, on allied sides? What attributes of the opponent? What might their doctrine be? Games are a tool for bringing to the surface potential actions or operations that you might not otherwise have thought of. They're certainly not to predict the future, and net assessment games are different from games that are conducted for other purposes.
So I'd throw out two thoughts. One is, I think it's really important not to treat war games as surrogate history, and that is frequently a temptation. And in fact, I remember from my own days at the Naval War College, which I remember fondly, the historians on staff would get really upset, and I think entirely rightly so, when somebody would say, well, in the big annual war game, we proved that thus and such would happen. And their answer was, you proved nothing. These are not predictions of what would happen if you had the war today. They offer you one way of thinking about it. The other thing that I would say is, and this can sound like a swipe at wargaming. It's not intended to be. War games can also, if you look at them dispassionately, can reveal the lazy assumptions that all human beings make about their world. My favorite was always the war games involving the canonical Russians come charging across the inter-German border, and NATO mobilizes, and the assumption was and the question was, how many days of warning do you have, and what can you move around, and so on. And of course, the assumption was always that all, I think it was then 16 NATO nations, mobilize simultaneously and do everything that they promised they were going to do. Well, if there's one thing we know about coalition warfare, that never happens. It's an absurd assumption. And in fact, that should then lead you to think about, well, what does a war look like if some allies on the day say, in the old German phrase, ohne mich, we'd really rather not engage in this one, or they simply take time to make a decision that could have ruinous consequences for their country. So it's that I think, and I do think that for net assessment, that was one of the functions of war games. It was forcing people to really look at certain assumptions that they were making and ask, well, do we really think those things are true or not?
Next question is from Bob Angevine, SICE alum and longtime net assessor. It's really good question. Net assessment drew heavily on the business world of the 1960s and 1970s for its analytic approach and emphasized a long-term perspective. As the business world increasingly emphasizes short-term profits and policymaking demand quick answers, how do practitioners of net assessment maintain that long-term perspective and counsel strategic patience? And I'd even expand that to kind of the broader engagement between kind of defense and business. It seems to me that there's it's kind of a mutual admiration society. Folks in business think that defense has the answers, and folks in defense think that business has the answers. Who'd like to tackle that?
I'll take an initial crack at that. I think it's first.
I can jump in, and it's interesting. Sorry. Go ahead, please.
I think that one part of the intellectual history of net assessment is that it was tapping a certain kind of business strategy thinking that was going on beginning to go on in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. So it's people like Michael Porter and so on, thinking about long-term competitive advantages and so on. And it melded very nicely with some of the net assessment thing that was going on. The truth is, although I think you're right, you're probably right in general, it's also true there are a lot of businesses that do think pretty long-term. I mean, I remember actually a conversation with you, Tom, where you and I were on a bus in Scotland, I think. And we were talking about, okay, what are the industries that have to have a long time horizon? And it was definitely in Scotland, because we were thinking about, how do you think about the market for 18-year-old Talisker?
It was about distillers. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So it was triggered by the place. And clearly, if you're in the distillery business, you got to think long-term in some ways. And there are others too, big lumber companies and so on. Companies which have huge investments that have become fixed costs, mining industry. But even a big company like Walmart, I don't think that they are simply short-terming it all the time. So I think the thing is that I think folks in the defense world, I completely agree with what you said, Tom, that there's this kind of mutual admiration society where neither side knows quite how screwed up the other side is. I think, there are many different kinds of business, and some of them are very short-term oriented and others are quite long-term oriented. And the same thing is true on the defense side. I mean, there's no place for this kind of long-term thinking in a lot of what the defense establishment does.
Professor Ridd.
Yeah, I would just start to question the premise of the question a little bit, because I think the relationship between government and business in the context of security and defense related questions has fundamentally shifted after the end of the Cold War, in my perspective. Certainly in the fields that I'm focused on. Let's just say cybersecurity writ large for now. And what we see there is that there's a vibrant marketplace for analysis as well as for providing analysis, from private sector companies to other private sector companies about long-term trends in adversary, for example, espionage operations. And it's important to understand, for those of you who are not deeply familiar with this field, for example, that we're looking at very long-term behavioral patterns and trend lines. I mean, stretching more than a decade. People think it's the internet and its technology must all be very fast and change all the time, but that is absolutely not the reality of these operations. They're very long-term, campaigns, adversaries change their behavior, incrementally, and you can trace them for sometimes more than 2 decades. So I think there's an interesting new long-term thinking emerging in places where people really just don't expect it.
Let me take one last question, and because unfortunately it has to be the last, I think, just because time is drawing to a close. We have a lot of really good questions, and I think it's we could go on with a really rich discussion for some time. But the last question I want to choose is actually sort of a follow-on to what Professor Ridd just said in the previous discussion, which is net assessment is known for identifying asymmetries and key trends in a competition, in a long-term competition. To what extent are there challenges in operationalizing those insights, and how does one overcome those challenges? So it's a huge topic, but I think it's a key one. Jackie, could I call on you first? Do you have some thoughts there on that?
Sure. I guess there needs to be a baseline kind of agreement on the importance of strategy. And I guess this is partly an answer to the previous question as well. If strategy is out of fashion, and if businesses just think they can kind of adapt on the fly and that's the thing to do, and there isn't really such a thing as strategy, then that's problematic if it's in the ether, and if people in the defense establishment don't believe in strategy, they only believe in logistics or something, that might be problematic. But I have the sense that that whole way of thinking is maybe a fad that belongs to the period when it was less clear that we were in a major power competition, and we're coming out of that period. And I agree that there are some firms that are highly strategic. Maybe they operate quietly, and their strategic acumen is less noticed than the popular kind of, we're just going to be adaptive trends that you see in a lot of big companies. But the ones that have staying power, I think, really are strategic. And it is possible to navigate the anti-strategic tendencies if you're committed and you have data. If you have empirically grounded insight into the character of the competition and areas of potential opportunity or advantage for the United States. People generally want to do the right thing. And if you can arm people in various services or business areas within the Defense Department, say, with the information they need to make their case that their system or community, their platform is going to be highly effective, it's in their interest to follow through on that insight and to take the data and use it in conversations with big decision makers to the advantage of their community. And so I think that's one way that, despite the contrary forces in the environment, net assessment can prevail or deliver action.
Okay. Professor Ridd, did you want to comment on that?
I'll just make one interesting sort of anecdotal comment in the form of an anecdote or a finding. So, for example, what we see in the cybersecurity space is that the assessment of who hacked you, if you're a company, you're a large company, large companies tend to get breached and targeted. If you know who did it, you're more likely, that's an empirical finding in the UK. If you know who did it, you're more likely to invest in resources that will prevent you from getting hit again. So you have a direct relationship between, an intelligence assessment and business decisions on resources. So it's a fascinating example in that context, I think.
Dean Cohen, I'll give you the next to last word in answering it.
So as I understood the question, it's about, and correct me if I'm getting it wrong, Tom, it's the assessment of asymmetries.
Yeah, and barriers to acting on them, yeah.
And I think one of the lessons of the net assessment experience is it can be really hard to figure those out because, we all have these sort of common sense, well, everybody knows kinds of beliefs and asymmetries, which can frequently turn out to be wrong. So a classic one from World War II was Americans and the British actually assumed that the German army was very top-down and rigid, and as a result probably of seeing too many bad movies in which there were German villains, and there's a lot of heel clicking and rigid obedience to orders, when actually that was the furthest thing from the truth. Actually, there was much more room for initiative and creativity and decentralized decision making in the Wehrmacht. That was actually a major source of advantage to the German military during World War II, as opposed to what was a pretty rigid top-down structure in some of the opposing armies. Or a similar kind of a micro-level asymmetry that net assessment actually looked at was, there was a very famous assessment of American and Soviet tank crews that was done in the 70s, which I was able to get declassified, and I've got filed away somewhere. It was fascinating because the assumption was, well, the American tank crews will be much more skilled because, you know, it's a free system, it's an all-volunteer military, they're in for longer, and that turned out not to be true, because what happened was we discovered that what the Russians do is they just put you in as a gunner. And if you're a gunner, you just stay a gunner for the whole of your 2 years of military service. Whereas in the American system, you know, we believed in you rotate people around and give everybody, you know, you're a gunner for a couple of months, then you're a driver for a couple of months, and then you're a loader for a few months, and then you rotate out to your next assignment. So actually it turned out Russian tank crews much more stable and probably a lot more proficient at that point in time than their American counterparts. And for me, the lesson of that was that you can't take any of that stuff for granted. And it requires a really close study of the two sides, including, and with this I'll stop, including a close study of your own side. I think this is something that's frequently that's missed in net assessment. It's treated as a variant of intelligence analysis, and it's not, because the more difficult thing is sometimes to understand your own side. And, you know, I do recall from looking at the European military balances, we were frequently struggling as hard to figure out how many helicopters NATO had as how many helicopters the Warsaw Pact had. And I'm not joking.
Well, that's a fitting way to end this up. You know, Sun Tzu, you know, famously wrote, you know the enemy and know yourself, and in 100 battles you'll be undefeated. We tend to assume that it's harder to understand the adversary, and there certainly are all sorts of barriers to doing so, including active deception and concealment. But there are also some pretty deep barriers to knowing yourself, including things you may not want to know about yourself that are kind of ugly. And I think, if anything, you know, net assessment counsels, you know, the importance of doing that, of knowing thyself. Well, thanks to the panelists for giving of their time. Thanks to all of you for giving your time. Hopefully, this was just a foretaste of things to come. I think we had a very rich discussion. I think we could carry it on in various ways, and I would urge you all to read the volume, which addresses a number of these topics in depth. And so, thank you for your time, and look forward to carrying this conversation forward. Have a good day.